The fourth principle of Phariseeism is sanctified tradition. And in Hebrew, this is called minhag, or custom. And there's a principle in Phariseeism, minhag Yisrael Torahi. A custom of Israel is law. And what that means is that a custom done over and over by an Israelite or Jewish community over time becomes sanctified and it becomes an actual law. So I mentioned today that I'm dressed as a modern-day Pharisee. I don't actually dress normally this way. I'm dressed in the garb of a modern-day Pharisee to illustrate to you what it would mean to obey the Pharisees. And this is actually a sanctified outfit, a tradition that's been sanctified over time. And if you go to Jerusalem or New York or certain parts of Chicago, you'll see people all over dressed like this because they're following the sanctified tradition of their ancestors. Now, what do we mean by a sanctified tradition? Or the classic example of a sanctified tradition is wearing the head covering. And right now I'm going to illustrate to you what it would mean not to follow the traditions of the Pharisees, the sanctified traditions. We're going to peel away some of these man-made laws, some of these sanctified traditions. I'm going to take off the hat, because this is a traditional Pharisee hat. I'm going to take off the hat and peel away a layer of tradition. And now I'm left wearing the kippah, the skull cap. And the kippah is a tradition that's been sanctified over the last approximately 800 years. 1,000 years ago, there was no such thing as Jews wearing kippahs. It didn't exist. There was no such custom like that. Approximately over the last 800 years, this custom has been sanctified over time. And today it's been so sanctified that there's an actual law that, with its own rules and regulations that the Pharisees teach that you must wear the skull cap if you're a male. And this is described in the Shulchan Aruch, which we've seen before as the modern universally accepted guide to Pharisaical living. And there it says about the kippah, the skull cap, one may not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head. So this is not just a folk custom, I feel Jewish if I wear a kippah. No. If you wear the kippah, you're following this man-made law that's been sanctified over time and now is taken on its own rules and regulations. One may not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head. Let's see how that would work. So I'm going to take off my kippah, peel away another layer of tradition, and we're going to see what this means. Okay, so if I'm following this sanctified tradition, I can walk 1 cubit, and I can walk a 2nd cubit, and a 3rd cubit, and if I walk that 4th cubit, then I am violating the laws of the Pharisees, this sanctified tradition. There's another law there in the Shulchan Aruch concerning the head covering, and there it says, it is forbidden to pray with an uncovered head. That's very interesting, and I think that matter speaks for itself. But what you can see here is this is not just a folk custom or tradition. This is something that has been sanctified over time and now is taken on its own rules and regulations. Well, what's wrong with that? Many people will say, well, it makes me feel good to wear a kippah. It makes me feel more Jewish, not just to wear the kippah, the skull cap, but to follow all these different traditions. Even if I'm not Jewish by extraction, I feel good following these traditions. It makes me feel closer to the ancient roots. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with adding new commandments, with sanctifying these traditions? What's wrong with it is that the Torah specifically forbids us from doing this. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, it says, you shall not add unto the matter which I command you today, nor shall you diminish anything from it, to keep the commandments of Jehovah your God, which I am commanding you. There's a specific prohibition in the Torah from adding to the Torah. So if we add these man-made laws, if we follow these sanctified traditions, we are partaking in adding to the Torah. Now it's very interesting here because in the same breath that it forbids us from adding to the Torah, it forbids us from taking away from the Torah. So to follow one of these sanctified traditions is no different than abolishing the Sabbath, adding the Torah and taking away. Those are both a violation of this fundamental law in the Torah of adding or taking away from the Torah. Now, this appears a second time. There's a second witness to this. Deuteronomy 12:32. All that I am commanding you shall diligently do. You shall not add to it or diminish from it. You must not add to the Torah or take away from the Torah. And the question becomes, if you follow these man-made laws, these sanctified traditions, who are you obeying? Who are you being obedient to? Are you being obedient to our Creator, or are you following these man-made laws which are in addition to the Torah? This appears a third time. Proverbs 30, verse 6. There we're told, do not add unto his words, lest he reprove you, and you be found a liar. I don't want God calling me a liar. I don't want any part of that. Well, the fifth principle of Phariseeism is very similar to number 4. And the fifth principle is the commandments of men, or enactments in Hebrew, the takanot. The takanot, that's the fifth principle of Phariseeism. Has anybody heard that word before, takanot? Is that familiar from anywhere? Yes? Okay, so let's all say that together. Takanot! Okay, so takanot, these man-made laws, and these are actually called by the rabbis, they use another term for this, mitzvot rabbanan, commandments of our rabbis. And the rabbis actually make a very clear distinction between laws that they derive from the Torah, albeit using their irrational method of interpretation, and laws that they derive simply by either tradition or by a rabbinical enactment. And the truth is that sometimes they can't distinguish between whether a certain law was established by tradition, by doing it over and over, or whether it was established by the rabbi sitting down and making a new enactment. And so really those are very related and similar categories. But there's a very clear distinction between that and laws derived from the Torah, even using the irrational methods of interpretation. Now, the classic example of takanot, or commandments of our rabbis, is the washing of the hands. And because the oral law gives the rabbis the absolute authority to make these new enactments, they have a divine, God-given right to make new enactments. Because of that, you make the blessing, "Blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, commanding us to wash the hands." The rabbis know very well that God never commanded them to wash the hands, but what they mean by this is that God commanded you to obey the rabbis. By obeying the rabbis, you're indirectly obeying God. And this is very interesting. What this means is every time you sit down to eat a meal and wash your hands, you're actually proclaiming the God-given authority of the rabbis to make these enactments. Now, how many people are thinking here, I'm not going to do these rabbinical enactments, they're not from the Torah? How many people are thinking that? Okay, we got a good group of Pharisees here. Most people are. Okay, how many people are thinking you're not going to follow these man-made laws because they're not from the Torah? Okay, that's much better. Now, this is what the oral law says to everyone who raised their hands. It says in the Midrash, which is part of the oral law, it says, a person must not say, I will not keep the commandment of the elders because they're not from the Torah. You must not say that. The Almighty says to such a person, now they're literally putting words in God's mouth. The Almighty says to such a person, no, my son, rather all that they decree upon you observe. And then it goes on, and now it quotes Deuteronomy 17:11, as it is written, according to the instruction which they teach you. Now you could look up in Deuteronomy 17, and it's not talking about the Pharisees or rabbis. You won't see them mentioned anywhere. What it's actually talking about is the high priest at the temple and the prophetic judge. And what it talks about there is if there's a difficult court case and the lower judges, remember Moses came along and he appointed lower judges and lower judges below them because he couldn't handle judging every matter by himself. So what it's describing in Deuteronomy 17 is if one of those lower judges comes along and says, I don't know what the law is here, or this is a difficult case, I don't know what to do, then he goes to the high judge at the temple, or to the high priest at the temple. This is not talking about the Pharisees or the rabbis, and actually in the various passages, such as in Ezra chapter 2, verse 63, it talks about an actual case they had like this, and it says there that this had to be decided by the high priest with the Urim and the Thummim, or in Hebrew the Urim and the Tummim, which was a prophetic device that the high judge would go and ask, what is the answer? He would ask from God. He wouldn't just make it up, because God actually does have a say in how Scripture is interpreted. But the rabbis apply this to themselves, because to them God has no say, only they have a say. And then it goes on in the Midrash, and it says, remember God is speaking here, the Almighty. And it goes on there, and it says, even I must obey their decree. Even I, God, must obey the decrees of the rabbis. And by the way, it quotes a verse there from Job, which has nothing to do whatsoever with the authority of the rabbis or God obeying them. But the principle here is that the rabbis are given absolute authority not only to interpret Scripture, but to make new enactments, and God himself must obey those enactments according to the oral law. Well, now that we understand Phariseeism, let's get an overview. We see these 5 principles of Phariseeism, and the first principle is the concept of the 2 Torahs, the written Torah and the oral Torah. Then we have the authority of the rabbis, the absolute authority of the rabbis to interpret Scripture. God has no say in it, only the rabbis do. Irrational or midrashic interpretation, Scripture is a divine code, and things can be taken out of context. Sanctified tradition, such as the kippah, and the takanot, or commandments of men, such as the washing of the hands. Now, it was very interesting. I was giving this talk about a week ago, and afterwards a woman walked up to me and she said, Nehemia, when you were talking about the 5 principles of Phariseeism, you didn't really mean the Pharisees. You really meant my denomination of Christianity, right? And I said to her, I'm talking about what I know from my firsthand experience. I don't really know anything about your denomination of Christianity, but if the shoe fits, just make sure to put on the right shoe first. Don't tie it. Okay. Now, Now that we understand Phariseeism, what we need to do is go back to Matthew 15 and see if we can understand what's happening. The Pharisees come along and say to Yeshua, your disciples are transgressing the tradition of the elders because they don't wash their hands before they eat, which is that ritual we saw before. What is exactly going on there? There in verse 3, Yeshua says to the Pharisees, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? So how do the Pharisees transgress the commandment of God by their tradition? How is the Pharisee tradition a transgression of the commandment of God? They're adding to the Torah. Deuteronomy 4:2, Deuteronomy 12:32, and Proverbs 30 verse 6 forbid us to add to the Torah. And by adding these laws to the Torah, this commandment to wash the hands, it's a transgression of the commandment of God. Yeshua goes on in verse 6, and he says to the Pharisees, thus have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. How did the Pharisees make the commandment of God of none effect? This is something that I see every day in modern-day Israel. I see it all the time. One of the things that most people are surprised at when they come to Israel for the first time is that most Jews in Israel do not observe the Sabbath. Most people, when they come to Israel, are shocked to see that. And if you ask the average Israeli, why don't you keep the Sabbath? He'll respond and tell you, it's impossible to keep the Sabbath. And I respond, okay, I've been keeping the Sabbath my whole life. Why is it impossible? And he'll tell you, well, if I keep the Sabbath, I have to do this and I have to do that. And I can't do this and I can't do that. And every single thing he lists is something, these man-made traditions and laws that the Pharisees have foisted upon the nation, these heavy burdens they've loaded up upon the nation, and the average person can't always distinguish between what has the Creator commanded us and what are these man-made laws that the Pharisees have commanded. And because of that, they just completely give up and say, okay, I just can't do it. They give up, and by requiring these man-made laws, the Pharisees have made the commandment of God of none effect. They've made it impossible to keep the Torah. Now, I've been keeping the Sabbath my whole life, and I know from firsthand experience that it's a pleasure to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a delight. It's only when you add all these man-made laws and rules and regulations, then it becomes impossible to keep and it becomes a burden. And this is how the Pharisees make the commandment of God of none effect. Well, what we can see here very clearly in Matthew 15 is Yeshua is warning his disciples not to follow the man-made laws of the Pharisees. You must not follow the man-made laws. He goes on in verse 7. This is a very interesting passage, and he says, you hypocrites, speaking to the Pharisees, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying. And now he quotes Isaiah 29, verse 13. This people draws near unto me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Well, now we know what he's talking about, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. That is Phariseeism with their oral law and their man-made authority to interpret Scripture even above that of God, and their takanot and their sanctified traditions. That's teaching for doctrines the commandments of men.